Today I'm going to show you how you can edit beautiful cinematic skin tones just like these. Welcome back to my channel. Thank you for checking out another video, and today I'm going to be sharing all the little tricks and tips that I do to get my skin tones looking as beautiful as possible. And if you do learn something new today and you're excited to learn this, please consider hitting that like button, hitting subscribe and turning on those notifications by hitting the bell button. That would really help me grow this channel, which is something that I'm really hoping to do this year. So let's go ahead and get into it. So here we are in Premiere Pro, and I've got 4 clips loaded up into my timeline. Now the clips that I've chosen all have something about them which is just a little bit different, which is going to call on different skills, and we're going to have to do different things to get the skin tones looking accurate in each of these clips. So if you do watch all 4 of these clips, you're bound to pick up something new. And I'm going to go over as well sort of the main 3 to 4 sort of things you want to keep in mind when you're coloring your skin tones. So the first thing we want to make sure with our skin tones is that the color is accurate and we're getting an accurate skin tone. We then want to make sure that our skin tones are at the right exposure. We can get a little bit more stylistic by playing with the contrast in terms of the difference between the highlights and the shadows and how far away they are from each other, which is our basic contrast. And then we also have color contrast as well, which is something a little bit more stylistic. And this is where you might pick up something new from watching this video. So let's go ahead and we'll get started. So we're going to click on New Item and then come up to Adjustment Layer, hit OK on that, and we're going to go ahead and put that over the top of our footage. Just right there. Okay, so next we need to go ahead and select our skin tones. So we're going to use HSL secondary within Lumetri color. If you're not seeing Lumetri color, you can come up to Window, come down and make sure Lumetri color is checked. So let's use HSL secondary. We'll grab this dropper tool and we're going to put that on the skin tones. I'm then going to check the color gray box, and I'm going to start sliding these sliders around, and we're going to create a mask that is just selecting the skin tones only. So that's already looking pretty good. We'll see if we can get anything else out of these. So the idea is that you want to get as many of the skin tones as possible without getting the background as well. Now we've got our skin tone selected. We're going to add a little bit of denoise and a little bit of blur, just enough. And next we want to get some information from the skin tones. So they're already looking really good, but we want to make sure that they are accurate. So we're going to get into our scopes here. So Lumetri Scopes, if you're not seeing this, go to Window and then come down to Lumetri Scopes. Now there's 2 graphs that we want to see. First one is our vector scope YUV, which is right here. This is probably our most important one, at least for color accuracy. And the next one is a waveform, and I've got this set to waveform Luma, but waveform RGB is also useful to us as well. We can also check exposure with that, but we'll keep this on Luma. If you're not seeing these graphs here, just right click and make sure that these ones are selected. Okay, so let's check out our vector scope. Now what I want you to pay attention to here is this line that's running right through here. This is called our flesh line, and it's basically what we want to make sure our skin tones are laying upon. And by that I mean we're looking at this cloud here. Now this cloud is representative of all the pixels in our selection, and we can see that they're falling on this hue along here, so this color. So it's sort of in between yellow and red, or you could also say it's sort of in between green and magenta. And they're falling perfectly along this line in this scenario, so there's nothing we need to do in terms of changing our tint. So if it was over towards the magenta, we would move it towards the green, and if it was towards the green, we'd move it towards the magenta. So you can see that changing as I slide that around, but we're going to leave that right in the middle because it's looking really, really good. So for this case, what are we going to do to make these skin tones better? Well, there's a couple of things. Like I said before, we can make sure our exposure is correct on the skin tones, and our exposure should be falling sort of between, majority should be falling between 30 to 70, and we can see that majority of those are falling between there. So I'm actually happy with the exposure in this clip. I might bring up just a touch because we are outdoors actually. So just on second thoughts, we will bring that up a little bit, but I don't need to do that selectively just to the skin tones. It's actually the whole clip. So that's fine. We'll go back into HSL secondary and let's look at these skin tones again. Now, like I said before, we've got our color accuracy, we've got our exposure, we've got 2 ticks for each of those items, but we've also got contrast. And there's 2 types of contrast. We've got contrast between highlights and shadows. So when you add contrast to an image, we've got our highlights up here and our shadows down here, and you'll see that they will get further away from each other as we increase the contrast. So that's also looking really good. But let's just focus on skin tones. We'll go to HSL secondary, color/gray again, and let's click this box this time. So, or not a box, but rather these 3 circles. And we've got our shadows, midtones, and highlights now. So we can have specific control over our shadows, and we can bring those down. We can bring down our midtones, and we could increase our highlights. And that is going to give us contrast. So let's look at this before and after. So if I switch that off and then on, we've already created some really nice contrast here, and I would dare say things are looking a bit more cinematic. But let's take it one more step, and we're now going to add color contrast. So what I like to do here is bring blue into the shadows. Now you will see our skin tone changing, so I do like to have this in view while I'm doing this to make sure that I am staying along that flesh line regardless of the changes I'm making here. But I'm going to bring blue into the shadows. I'm going to bring in a bit of red and orange into the midtones. And I'm going to bring in some red into the highlights as well. So it's sort of representing that there is sort of blood flowing underneath the skin. It's a sort of a healthy subject, basically, is when we've got that red underneath there. So let's uncheck this. Let's look at our changes now. So that's looking really nice. And essentially, we can just play with this more until we're really, really happy with it. And I would say that I am really happy with how this is looking now. So we've got those skin tones looking really beautiful. They're really striking as well, and they make the subject really stand out. Now, one more thing we could consider here is our saturation of our skin tones. So the other thing we're looking at here is how far out this cloud juts towards the edges, and we can use sort of a percentage. So from the center to the middle here is 50%, and obviously as we get to the edge and increase saturation, we would approach 100%. Now these are obviously looking way oversaturated, and we'd never do that. So we'll bring it back to 0, and I would say that 50% is looking really good here, but as a general rule of thumb, it's usually more around 40% is sort of probably a little bit more natural. So let's check that out now. So we've just dialed it back a little bit. We're probably just under 50% now, which is something that I am probably happy with. And let's check out our changes. So this is completely before without anything. We've adjusted our exposure, our skin contrast, and we've added in, we've considered both color contrast and difference between shadows and highlights. So we've got a really beautiful looking skin tone and a really beautiful overall image with this one. So let's move on to the next one. Now in this situation, I've gone ahead and I've actually color graded everything apart from skin tones, because the skin tones were really magenta here. And in this case, I can make the subject look a lot better if I do correct that inaccuracy. So I'm actually just going to reset some things that I must have had here before. So let's go ahead and let's look at what's happening in these skin tones. So HSL secondary, dropper tool, click the skin tone. Now we're getting some weird stuff happening here. So let's just see what's going on. So sometimes the selection tool doesn't always work. I'll just select a different part of the skin. That's looking better. Okay, much better. Let's again create our selection, move our sliders around, perfect. That's looking excellent. All right, so I'm happy with that. Bit of denoise, bit of blur on there, and let's see what's happening. So we're looking at our vector scope here, and we're seeing that this cloud of pixels is telling us that we are in fact towards the magentas. We've got a bit of a bulge out this way, and so that's something we're going to need to go and correct. So what I'll do here is we're going to move, oh, there was actually a little bit of green already on there. So I'm going to actually move this towards the green this time and get that nice and in the center. let's have a look at it now. So before and after, so already looking a whole lot nicer. Let's go in and now add a bit of color contrast. So blue into the shadows, some orangey red into the mids, and then some red and again orangey into the highlights as well. And what I do like to do, as I mentioned before, is I do like to have this in view while I am doing this, so I can keep in mind where this cloud is. So as I move into the highlights, there's still a little bit too magenta, I would suggest. So I'm going to go highlights, and then I'm going to move my mouse to the left towards the green side of that color wheel, and just massage this across to the left. I can do it with the midtones as well. And let's check again how we're looking. So I'm getting really happy with the color accuracy, and we can see that everything's falling along the flesh line, so that's looking really good. Just a word of caution as well, don't always rely on the vector scope. Always check your image as well to make sure that you are seeing an image that is tasteful and you're liking the look of, as well as the flesh line giving you information that is leading to accurate skin tones. So this is looking really great. I'm loving how accurate these skin tones are now, but I feel that it needs more contrast between the shadows and the highlights, because I want to make this a little bit more moody. So we've got the shadows falling all on this sort of near side of the face, and I'm going to bring down these shadows, and we're going to start creating some contrast, maybe a little bit in the mids as well. Again, not too much, just everything's all about balance when you're doing any sort of color grading. So that's now looking really nice. I'm going to bring down highlights a little bit too, because it is a bit bright on that far side of the face. Again, and you can just see how much we can sort of go with this. Obviously don't like that, but I would recommend as well often using Control-Z and then redo, just to see like if you are really enjoying your changes. So that's looking really good. So that's a great example of fixing a color issue, a color accuracy issue, and then introducing some contrast in terms of both color contrast and reducing our shadow to highlight ratio. Okay, let's move on to the next one. This is going to be quite similar to what we're doing, except we are dealing, instead of a magenta skin tone, something that's slightly more green. So let's go ahead and have a look at this. And actually, before I do anything in HSL secondary, there is a bit of a color shift in the overall image towards being a bit too warm. So I'm just going to cool this down a little bit overall, which is also going to help correct our skin tones. And I can double check to see how warm that is, or how warm it was rather, by changing my waveform type to RGB. And I can see that along the tops of these ridges in a majority of the image, I am seeing that the red is still coming through as strongest. Now I want to correct that, because there is a lot of white in the image too, and I want those whites to be perfect. So you can see I've just introduced a little bit more blue, and now we've got that redness disappearing. But we've got a little tinge of green, so I'm just going to ever so slightly increase that magenta, and that's probably as good as we can get. So we've now just done a white balance, which is a great start. The other issue here is going to be our exposure, and I'll actually just use the skin tones to make this change, since this video is all about the skin tones. So let's go back to Luma. We'll go to HSL secondary. Let's start selecting these skin tones. So we'll just bring these up, and again, just trying to get maximizing the amount of skin tone without the background. That's going to be fine. Now skin tones are falling between 20 and 70. Now I think these could come up just a little bit more. There is a significant amount that are falling below 30. So I'm just going to increase the exposure of the overall image, because I think it could just in general be a bit brighter. Just inch that up a little. Let's go ahead and have a look at our overall image again. And yeah, I'm happy with where our image is sitting now. So I've corrected skin tones without using any controls within HSL secondary yet. I've used them as a guide for how bright the image should be. Okay, let's go ahead and look at our color accuracy. So looking really good now that we have made some changes to basic correction. So that's looking great. And we didn't really need to change too much in here. So I'm really happy with our color accuracy now. Again, let's go ahead and create some of that cinematic color contrast. So let's do 3 wheels here, blue into the shadows, some orange and red into those mids, and again the same into the highlights. And I'm monitoring this the whole time I'm doing this, and I'm just noticing there is a bit of a slight bulge towards the magenta. So as I bring in some orange and red, I'm going to move this wheel over to the left just a tiny bit, just to correct those tiny little subtle things. And let's now have a look at our image. Okay, so we've introduced a tiny bit of color contrast. That's just giving the skin a bit more oomph. And now let's bring down our shadows a bit and our mids. And I want to bring up the highlights just a touch too. A little bit more. Okay, and now that is looking awesome. So really getting those skin tones popping there. That's looking great. Let's move on to the last one. And this one's a really special case because there's quite a few issues here and a few complexities that you'd come across. So let's go ahead and let's just select our skin tones and see how we go. Okay, so let's click the skin, and already just on that first selection, we're seeing that Premiere Pro is selecting and finding a few things in the frame that are at the same hue. So HSL secondary is giving us a few issues right now because we can't get information about the skin tones using our vector scope, just because HSL secondary is selecting so much more than just the skin tones. And we can't help it in this case because the hue of the skin is also matching the hue of these bricks and even the hood of this car and some of the shirt. So there's just too much that it's selecting. So in this case, what we do is we're going to go to Effects Controls and create a mask. Now you can see I've already done one. I'm just going to create a new one for you. So let's start creating a mask around the skin. Just something really rough and quick and easy. Okay, so that's looking good there. Now let's go back to HSL secondary. Let's select our skin tones and let's just move our sliders around until we see his entire face. Okay, good. Bring these up as well. All right, great. So we've got all of the skin tones here in HSL secondary, and we'll go to Lumetri Scopes now. Okay, so we're now seeing just the skin tones in here. And unlike the previous images where there was an obvious sort of cloud of pixels heading out towards the flesh line, this one's a little bit different. So let's go ahead and just use these main sliders here to start correcting this. Now I'm going to introduce a bit of warmth to start with. Okay, good. And now I'm going to introduce some green. So we're definitely heading off towards magenta. So I'm going to introduce green. And now we're seeing something that looks a lot better and usable. Potentially just a little bit more warmth. Okay, good. Let's go ahead and let's turn off our mask and see how this image is looking. We're then going to uncheck the color gray. And our overall image is looking really good. So that's before and after. And our skin tones are also accurate. And we know that because when we had the mask on, we were following along the flesh line. Now, in this case, what I did was when I did the HSL secondary and made a mask, I had to, in order to get all of the skin tones, select so much more of the frame. So the reason I did that is because if the skin tones are inaccurate, it's likely that some of my settings in my camera were also inaccurate and it was causing other colors in the image to be inaccurate as well. So by correcting my skin tones, I was also, and selecting other things within the frame that was being picked up, I was in fact correcting other colors in my image. So it's absolutely fine to go ahead and make a HSL secondary that does select other things in your frame, because those things might be inaccurate as well. So we've now got a beautiful looking image. Let's go before and after. So before, it's looking very magenta, and now after, a lot more accurate, and that's looking excellent. We'll then see if, we'll just check our exposure real quick, and that's looking fine. And look, I'm really happy with how this image is looking. So we've got now 4 beautifully color corrected, color accurate, and a great level of contrast in all our images. So that wraps up today's video. I really hope you've learned something new and you can go out with this knowledge and improve your videos. If you are excited to go ahead and try these things and you have learned something new, please go ahead, feel free to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on those notifications, because it'll really help me to build this channel this year, which is something that I'm really excited to try and do this year. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.